You got the main shaft of the transmission over here on the workbench. You're going to disassemble it to get it cleaned up. See if there's any dog teeth I need to fix. There are two bearings that are going to be replaced. One's right here, one's down here on the very bottom, just outside the frame. Now right there it is. So we'll replace this bearing and this bearing. To start taking this apart, first thing I'm going to do is just pull this bearing off, because this one actually just slides off by hand, at least on my shaft. I'm not sure if it's supposed to do that or not. The next thing we have to take off is this snap ring right here. So you're going to need a big pair of snap ring pliers. Lift that snap ring up and off. Now this collar here is going to spiral up the gear teeth. This next one will as well, around them teeth. So now our first gear will come off. This is either third gear or reverse gear. Not sure which, it's probably third. These dogs have some pretty good wear on them, but they're all pretty consistent, so probably won't mess with those too much. Now if you're unsure of how to keep your gears in order, just take like a punch or something and put like a number 3 or 1. Yeah, just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as you go down. Just whatever works for you. You can also put, like mark here for the top. This is the top. Just keep track of everything. Our next pair of parts is the actual shifter hub. It's not really a synchro since this is a non-synchronized transmission. But you got your slider ring and your hub assembly. Since these wear together on these sliders, try to keep those in order. Like say that was third gear, make sure you got third there and reverse down, and always keep it that way. There's the next one. So it should be reverse. It's not too bad. Next up we have a little thrust washer with the key. It goes in a groove inside the shaft. Next, another snap ring. Comes our next gear. This is probably fourth gear. Okay. Now this hub here is either cast or machined and then a press fit on this main shaft. So we're going to just pull off just the slider. So you cannot move this hub. It is not splined like the 3 reverse hub. So now, to get these gears off, we now have to go from this way. So the first thing we got to do is now press off this top gear. Now there's a couple ways you can do this, but you have to be very careful here, depending on how you're going to do it. Obviously the best way is to just get underneath the bearing and pull the bearing up. However, there is a thrust washer right here underneath it you can't really get underneath the bearing. So you can cut this bearing off. So I'm going to take a cutoff wheel or a good pair of diagonal cutters if you got one and cut this cage off. And then I'm going to come in here on this inner race and I'm going to cut it at an angle with the cutoff wheel. And I'm going to take a chisel and a hammer and hit where I cut it and crack that race. And that'll allow it to come off. So I'm not going to bore you with that because it's kind of a tedious process. That and you ain't going to be able to really hear anything other than a grinder running. So I'm going to get that taken care of real quick and then come back. Cut the race off. And you can see the groove that I cut right here. And once I cut that groove, I took a chisel and I stuck it right there on that edge and smacked it with a hammer. And it cracked that race. So now the race comes off and goes flying on the floor. So now, thrust washer. And if you nick your shaft right here with the grinder, you're okay. As you see, I can even hit the gear a little bit. So there's first gear. These are a little rounded on this one, so I might have to do some work on it. Once again, and this hub here and shifter is splined together. They come off. Then comes second gear and another thrust washer. And then fifth gear will slide off the shaft. So there's the main shaft ready to be cleaned up along with all the other parts. So I'll get them cleaned up, do any necessary doctoring that I need to do, and we'll get it put back together. Alright, so I got all my gears for the main shaft all cleaned up. I didn't doctor anything because after I got everything cleaned up and kind of played around with them, they seemed to engage just fine, so I didn't want to risk anything. So we're going to start to put this main shaft back together. Okay, so for starters, I got the main shaft just stood up. The first thing we're going to put on is fifth gear. Now when we install this, the dog teeth need to go down. Just give it a little spin, make sure everything's moving freely. Next thing we're going to install is our thrust washer. There's a little key right here that goes onto the shaft keyway. Our next gear is going to be second. It goes on with the dog teeth facing up. Our next thing is going to be our 1-2 slider and hub. If you disassemble these, keep track of how you take them apart. Now for me, I noticed that one side has like a notch on the slider and the other has a chamfer. Well, on the 1-2 hub, there's an indent here where the thrust washer. So the chamfer went to the indent. So slides on our main shaft with the chamfer up and our thrust washer groove up. Speaking of our thrust washer, here's the thrust washer. Next thing to install is going to be first gear, dog teeth down. Next thing, another thrust washer. This washer is not keyed, it just goes on. Now we're ready to put a bearing on here. This bearing that goes on this end is a 247/80. Okay, so now I got to take this over to the press and press this bearing on. Now, when I go to press it, I cannot set anything here because this will just slide up. So I'm going to have to set the press way down here at the bottom to press this bearing on. Okay, so this thrust washer is going to set on a collar here. So we're going to press this bearing down until it stops. So now that this bearing's on, it's time to build out the rest of the main shaft. Okay. So now we're back over here at the bench. Everything spins nicely when it's not engaged. Of course, fifth gear still spins. Next thing to go on is our 4/5 slider. On this one, the chamfer is facing up, so it's kind of reverse of the one down here on our 1-2. But that is the way that it came off. That's the way I'm putting it back. Next up is fourth gear. Then we have our first snap ring. Push it down until it seats in that groove. Next thing is another thrust washer with a key. slide it down into the key groove. Next is either third or reverse. I'm not sure which one this is. I think I'd be smart enough to look at it before I started filming, but this is either third or reverse. I'm thinking it's reverse, but I can't remember. But anyway, that gear's going on. I believe I got my two gears backwards here. Hang on a second. Ooh, I did. That's another thing. If you ever get these gears out of order, they pretty much only go on one spot on the shaft. You see how that gear will slide down? But that gear will not. That's because this gear has a smaller inner diameter. See, this gear will go all the way down. So I had those two reversed from where I cleaned them up. So that gear's there, that's correct. Next up, third reverse slider hub assembly. If you take this slider apart, you'll notice notches on one set of teeth and not the other. Those notches correspond to the chamfer on the slider ring. Slider ring goes up, just like so. And then our last gear, which is, like I say, that's third or reverse. That might be third. So the last thing to put on here before our last bearing are these locks assemblies. And they just spiral down the gear. And then we got this lock here. And it'll go down. Now this lower one, well, sometimes, there it'll go. I just had to wiggle the gear. This lower one will spin, so you can line it up. So just spin it. Until it locks into the upper portion. And of course, it's going to fight me here. There it goes. Nope. And this wing will only line up one way. So be sure you install it in the correct location. Like I say, this will still spin, or you can line them up. But if you can't get this to line up, flip it over. I think I still managed to get mine wrong. Okay, so once it fully seats down and you can get your snap ring on, you have that installed correctly. So put on the snap ring. And locks everything in place. All your gears spin freely. And you're good. So the last thing to put on is the bearing. That bearing is a 2/6 Bearing is a 26882. This bearing on me slid right off. Not sure if that's normal or not. I was tapping it on there with the hammer just to see if I could maybe get it to go down. It doesn't want to. So I might take this back over to the press. Stick the bottom of the shaft in there and just press on the top bearing. Just press that bearing in till it seats flush. Down here, just barely below the shaft up top. But there's the main shaft reassembled, ready to go back into the transmission. And this time it's all nice and clean, so we ain't gotta worry about getting oily.